Georgia needs tort reform, and they need it now.
Governor Brian Kemp reveals the outlines of his top legislative priority, reining in civil litigation.
Also known as tort reform or lawsuit reform.
And already, Democrats are pushing back.
This is a giveaway to the big insurance companies. Brian Kemp is either lying or being lied to about how and why these premiums have increased and what to do about it.
Tort reform is complex with many competing interests.
But we're going to break it down. And if you think tort law is totally in the weeds, think again.
We could all, in a split second, be a potential defendant or a potential plaintiff in a torts case.
Also on this show, we'll take a closer look at Democrats' renewed effort to expand Medicaid and the bill's difficult path ahead.
We believe that this bipartisan legislation can actually get passed. And we're going to work hard to make sure that actually takes place.
Plus, we continue to track how Trump's swift moves to reshape the government are playing out in Georgia. Today, we'll look at those immigration raids and that controversial federal funding freeze. I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Sam, Governor Kemp has been pitching tort reform since before this session began and previewing a push for well over a year. He's called it his top legislative priority. Now a plan has finally landed on lawmakers' desk. We're going to start digging into the details, but first, Sam, you're going to take us to law school for a little Torts 101.
Yeah, I've been talking to Emory University Law School Vice Dean Joanna Shepard. She's an expert in tort law, and she's going to help us understand what we mean when we talk about tort reform. So tort law, Rahul, deals with civil action other than breach of contract. Some common elements in tort cases: someone's usually been harmed or injured. This is a case usually between two entities, but one is not a prosecutor, unlike a criminal case. And whereas criminal cases usually end in a fine or a sentence of prison or probation, tort cases usually end with a damages payment or somebody has to stop some action they're doing. The types of reforms can get wonky really quickly, but for now, let's just think about torts really broadly.
It's one of my favorite classes to teach, and it's often a lot of law students, one of their favorite courses, because it's really applicable to all of us. We could all, within the next hour, do something that makes us a potential defendant in a torts case or a potential plaintiff.
Okay, now let's put some meat on this. Shepard says there are some common types of tort cases.
The most common things we see out in the world are things like potentially car accidents, if there's somebody at fault. There's, medical malpractice. There's products liability when somebody's injured by a product. Premises liability is when somebody is hurt on somebody else's property.
So you can see how so many different interests are involved. You've got doctors, lawyers, businesses, insurance companies, regular people. And now when it comes to reforms, that can mean a lot of things. And we're going to get to what Kemp is talking about here in a moment. But broadly, tort law has to weigh competing interests. Just take the example of premises liability.
It's complicated. It's very complicated. There is going to be this trade-off between, yes, victims deserve to be compensated for their harms, and just even forcing defendants to pay that compensation should deter them from having risky or dangerous premises in the future. So all of that is on one side of the coin.
And the flip side?
If you impose too harsh of liability against businesses and they leave and move to another state that's viewed as more business friendly, that's not good for the state either. I believe that most people should recognize that in most of these situations, there really needs to be a balancing of the different factors.
So you can see how figuring out what that balance is and how to get there can be kind of subjective. And different people may place different importance on one factor or the other. Plus, there's a lot of confounding variables involved, like lots of things shape insurance rates, for example, not just tort law. So when I showed Shepard and another professor, Beth Birch at the University of Georgia Law School, the top lines of Kemp's proposals, they both use the same phrase: the devil's in the details. And so next, we'll be poring over these two bills filed on Thursday to get a better handle on the specifics.
So now that we have the basics down, let's talk about what we do know about Kemp's proposal, which he unveiled on Thursday in a very big press conference. He was joined by top Republicans, business and healthcare executives. there was this really huge crowd that filled the north wing of the state capitol. There were viewers crowded along the railings going up 2 floors.
Grocery stores, hospitals, road pavers, small business owners, truckers, restaurants, mom and pop stores, retailers, gas stations, doctors, child care facilities, and hardworking Georgians across our state are all telling us the same thing. Georgia needs tort reform, and they need it now.
Kemp says excessive civil litigation has resulted in higher insurance premiums for medical providers, small business, corporations, also for individuals who buy health or auto insurance. He argues that reining in civil actions and the hefty damages that insurance companies have to pay will bring costs down. Kemp is proposing nearly a dozen changes to Georgia's tort law, including raising the standard for premises liability and changing how some damage awards are determined. The legislation also makes changes to some civil litigation procedures, like requiring liability to be established before a jury can hear evidence of a plaintiff's damages. Kemp also wants to allow a jury to know if a plaintiff wore a seatbelt and adds regulations around third parties that fund litigation, among other changes. As you mentioned, this bill was just filed, so we're just looking through it to get a better understanding of the details and the specifics, which will be debated over the coming weeks, Sam.
We've also heard early criticism from Democrats even before Kemp released this plan. 2 Democrats have kind of taken the lead on pushing back on Kemp's proposals, Representative Tanya Miller and Senator Josh McLaurin. We should note that both are attorneys who handle or have handled civil litigation cases in their jobs outside of the Capitol. We heard from McLaurin at the top saying this is basically a giveaway to big insurance companies. Democrats say they understand that small businesses are struggling with high premiums, but say it's disingenuous to say it's mostly because of civil litigation.
Insurance companies are making billions of dollars of profit in Georgia and nationwide, and they are threatening to leave the state if they don't make as much profit as they want. So what they've done is they've put Brian Kemp and Georgia businesses in a hostage situation. And unfortunately, what's happened is the insurance companies have blamed a red herring.
McLaurin says Georgia needs insurance reform, not tort reform. So a key question here, what leverage do Democrats actually have? Are there proposals they can get behind? And does Kemp even need Democratic votes? Representative Miller says no one has asked Democrats for their help yet.
Negotiation is always on the table. We're legislators. It's our job to negotiate. It's our job to hear all sides of an issue. My caucus has not been brought to the table. No one has asked us our opinion. So we await that opportunity when and if it comes.
And Sam, I think it's important to remind people that not all Republicans are on the same page with the governor. There are Republicans, including some that are trial lawyers, who agree with Democrats and believe that insurance companies are the ones who need to be reined in. One of those people, Republican State Senator Colton Moore.
Insurance rates continue to climb, and that same rhetoric isn't going to work anymore. My constituents are sick and tired of having insurance claims and none of the insurance companies ever paying what they originally agreed to in contract, and tort is the only way to get that justice.
Let's take a break. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
All right, we're going to stay here at the state capitol where, Sam, you covered another big legislative rollout. This time from Democrats. They're making another attempt to extend health coverage to more Georgians under Medicaid. What's notable here is that there are 4 Republicans signed on, but Governor Kemp has made clear he will not back fully expanding Medicaid. Sam, what's going on here?
Democrats call their plan to cover hundreds of thousands of Georgians Peach Care Plus. Georgia is one of just 10 states that has not fully expanded Medicaid. But unlike nearly all of the other 40 states that have, Georgia would do something different. The state would use mostly federal funds to pay for plans on the private market. This is a model that's been adopted in Arkansas and has attracted interest from some Republicans. Advocates say Peach Care Plus would cover more people than Georgia Pathways. That is the state's more limited Medicaid expansion program with a work requirement that Kemp has been pushing. Enrollment in that program, though, has been really sluggish, though Kemp says he is totally committed to it.
Okay, Sam, I think the question is what makes Democrats and these 4 Republicans think that this can change?
Yeah, so this effort does seem kind of unrealistic, right? I mean, Kemp has been extremely clear. But Senate Minority Leader Harold Jones told reporters this week it was a watershed moment last year when a bill similar to Peach Care Plus fell just short of advancing out of committee with some GOP support.
We came so close last year. And so that helps. That gives you the momentum. And that's why we didn't want to lose that.
Republican Senator Russ Goodman represents a rural district like the other Republican co-sponsors of this bill. In Georgia, some rural hospitals have struggled to stay open, and expanding coverage to more low-income adults could help. Goodman says the rural hospital near his farm proved critical when his son nearly got electrocuted as a kid.
You know, if that rural hospital hadn't have been there, I don't know that my son would be here today. It's something that I think about often when we have these discussions.
Goodman told me he wants this debate about expansion, even though the leader of his party is against it. And even if he's not sure, he'd ultimately vote yes if this bill got to the floor.
I probably agree with my wife 80% of the time, and I sleep in the bed with her. And I probably agree with Brian Kemp 95% of the time, you know. So I may very well vote against it on the floor. I just want to have the debate.
Now, Democrats like House Minority Leader Carolyn Hughley hope they can convince enough Republicans.
Under the Gold Dome, a no might mean not now, and windows are never really closed.
But that window, Rahul, may not really swing open again until Governor Kemp has left the building.
And Sam, I want to turn now to some policy changes back in Washington that are having effects here in Georgia, and in this case, immigration. The week began with immigration arrest in Metro Atlanta, including one at a Tucker church that got local and national media attention. And of course, attention here at the state capitol. Democratic State Senator Kim Jackson of Stone Mountain, who is a pastor herself, takes issue with something like that happening.
So let me be clear. Churches are places that historically have been considered sanctuaries, safe spaces for people to go to worship their God, to be with their families. And when we violate those type of safe spaces, we create terror in a community.
Jackson also brought up concerns about hospitals and schools not being safe spaces. Freshman Democratic State Representative Gabriel Sanchez of Smyrna talked to me about what he can do as a lawmaker.
The biggest thing that we can do is inform our constituents to make sure they know their rights. We do have rights, and making sure that people understand that they don't have to answer to ICE or law enforcement when they come in. They do have constitutional rights.
As for Republican, State Senator John Albers of Roswell talked about some of the key points that we're hearing from many in the GOP.
We're a nation and a state of laws. And what's happening right now is we're taking people who are illegally here in our country, and we are making sure that they are going back to their country of origin. And if they have a legal standing to be in this country, then they can follow the process like every other legal immigrant has since the beginning of our nation's foundation.
Albers added that he trusted law enforcement on where they're arresting people, and he pushed back on arguments that this will hurt Georgia economically. As for new legislation that could come out of this, Sam, Republican State Senator Blake Tillery of Vidalia has filed legislation that would take away legal protections from local governments that don't follow immigration laws.
If a family loses a loved one because Georgia elected officials don't follow Georgia immigration law, then that city or that elected official should stand civilly responsible for the loss to that family.
Now, that's Senate Bill 21, which has been sent to the Senate Public Safety Committee.
Also this week, President Donald Trump signed his first piece of legislation of his second term, the Laken-Riley Act.
Now, Congress passed that act in response to the murder of nursing student Laken Riley on the campus of UGA by a man who authorities say entered the U.S. illegally. He was later found guilty of murder. A number of Georgia state leaders and lawmakers made their way to Washington for the signing ceremony, including House Speaker John Burns.
You know, the American people gave President Trump a mandate to make sure we did something about criminally illegal immigration. and we know he's doing just that.
So a couple of other notable names at the signing included Georgia Congressman Mike Collins, who sponsored the bill, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, and some of the state lawmakers who were behind last year's House Bill 1105, which was also in response to Riley's murder. That state law requires that local sheriffs check the status of anyone they think is not in the country legally. As for the federal Laken Riley Act, that allows federal agents to detain undocumented immigrants accused of crimes like theft or shoplifting. Still, there's a debate over these laws, how they'll be implemented, and whether they could have prevented Riley's death.
Let's stick with the dizzying crush of changes from the new Trump administration. This week, the administration ordered a freeze on lots of federal grants and funding. Now, a federal judge temporarily blocked the freeze, but it caused all kinds of confusion for local and state organizations that receive federal funding, like the Atlanta Housing Authority and Partners for Home. Atlanta Chief Policy Officer Courtney English told a city council committee that some providers were unable to access funds on Tuesday that they needed for Wednesday payroll.
Concerning is the best way to say it. Gravely distressing is how I would describe it. And so we are seeing reports from the White House saying that this program won't be affected or that program won't be affected. Well, they are being affected.
Now, the White House eventually backtracked and rescinded the memo on Wednesday afternoon.
Sam, let me take you inside the halls of the state capitol. For the roughly 48 hours this memo was in effect, there was so much confusion. What was affected? Who was affected? Sam, I can't tell you the number of times lawmakers simply said to me, I don't know. Now, while this memo has been taken back for now, I don't think the focus on federal monies sent to state and local governments along with local organizations is going away. And that's a big deal, Sam. According to the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, the state's proposed fiscal year 2026 budget, the one that kicks in July 1st, anticipates $22.5 billion for Medicaid, education, infrastructure, and more. Look, something I focused on, Sam, during that 48 hours is the proposed Rivian plant east of Atlanta on the Morgan County-Walton County line. In the final days of the Biden administration, the U.S. Department of Energy signed off on a $6.6 billion loan that would help the electric vehicle manufacturer build that plant. Look, we've heard mixed messages for and against EVs from President Trump on the campaign trail, so I'm going to keep an eye on that deal. Bottom line from Republicans, and that is before this memo was rescinded, they believe that there needs to be a line-by-line review of spending in Washington, even if it's at the expense of things they might care about. For Democrats, their bottom line was this: look at all the chaos that's being caused and look at the folks that are being hurt.
Also in Washington, I want to note 2 Trump administration nominees to keep eyes on. This week, a Senate committee held a confirmation hearing for former Senator Kelly Loeffler. The Georgia Republican's been tapped to lead the Small Business Administration.
I'll leverage my decades of business experience to champion America's entrepreneurs. We'll cut red tape and modernize this agency while restoring the accountability and transparency that taxpayers deserve.
And Senator Raphael Warnock was among the senators who questioned Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Kennedy's up for Secretary of Health and Human Services. At HHS, Kennedy would oversee the Atlanta-based Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And Warnock asked Kennedy about that, including past statements about the agency, like 2013 comments where he seemed to compare CDC actions to Nazi death camps.
For me, those are disturbing characterizations of the CDC workers that I know who are trying to keep the American public safe. I need to know, do you stand by those statements that you made in the past, or do you retract those previous statements?
Yeah, I was not comparing the CDC to Nazi death camps. I was comparing the injury rate to our children to other atrocities. And any statement that I made has been interpreted that way. Yeah, I don't agree with that.
Warnock also asked Kennedy about the administration offering buyouts to all federal employees, including at the CDC. You know, tens of thousands of CDC workers are based right here in Atlanta. And this is part of the Trump administration's effort to try to fill agencies with loyalists.
The vast majority of the scientists and experts at CDC are patriots and good government servants.
Can you tell me yes or no?
I don't think anybody's going to resign who's committed to making America healthy again.
Can you just answer yes? Okay, you agree with the buyouts.
And Sam, let's stay in the Senate, but look ahead to 2026. This week, you learned that a national political committee for Senate Republicans is actively trying to recruit Governor Brian Kemp to run for U.S. Senate in 2026.
Yeah, usually I don't like to look ahead to the next election until we're through the current moment that we're in, but this felt compelling enough. Governor Kemp has been in contact with South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. Scott chairs the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which recruits and supports candidates. This news was first reported by Semaphore. Now, Kemp is a top recruit for national Republicans who really want to flip Georgia after recent defeats. Most recently, former Georgia football player Herschel Walker's loss to Senator Raphael Warnock. The eventual GOP nominee will face Senator Jon Ossoff, the only incumbent Senate Democrat defending a seat in a state Trump won in 2024. According to a senior Republican official in D.C., Scott has spoken with several Georgia Republicans, and all have suggested they would only run if Kemp does not. A Kemp political aide, Rahul, did not respond to a request for comment.
Sam, before we wrap up this segment, I do want to mention some of the breaking news out of our nation's capital following a tragedy where an American Airlines jet flying from Wichita, Kansas into Reagan Washington National Airport collided with a military helicopter right before it was supposed to land. It's an airport that you and I both know well as former residents of Washington, D.C., and still you and I visit regularly.
Yeah, my grandparents used to live in Indianapolis, Rahul, and I've flown on these American Eagle regional jets to visit them in and out of DCA so many times.
And bringing it back to Georgia, we are the home of the world's busiest airport, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. I absolutely believe that this horrible incident is going to lead to changes in procedures, for example, air traffic control, and we would see if that's going to affect areas like ours. The other thing is, you're likely going to see Georgia lawmakers in Washington be involved in some of the oversight and building of that legislation, something that we will be following. And of course, you and I thinking about the 67 people who have died from this horrible tragedy.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. If you love the Gold Dome Scramble podcast, you can find all that rich analysis and context right here on Plugged In.
And you could also help us by heading over to the feed dedicated to Plugged In, subscribing, and leaving us a rating or a review. It really helps us.
You can also keep tabs on this legislative session at wabe.org/under the gold dome.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Thanks for listening.